seen that the ongoing projection that's involved in identity construction results in what we often react to as the intimidating effect of openly expressed psychological splitting, in which there is a kind of psychological violence, and one that I've experienced on the left as well. I believe it has to do with projections of badness and with the threat of being cast out of a certain defined us. But as deployed by the right, we have seen an invocation of nationalism, austerity, and self-reliance go hand in hand with the expulsion of the contaminating and parasitic other, with virulent misogyny, and with the glorification of images of whiteness and power. All of this with a fervor that was quite difficult for the liberal left to counter. Against this splitting in the service of maintaining or gaining power, we observe how ineffectual were Obama's nostrums of bipartisan cooperation, or indeed any reasonable appeal. Because as we know, splitting creates not only a sense of I'm good, they're bad, but also of enjoyable power. So I would argue that by tepidly responding to the Republicans' form of splitting, Obama and the Democrats failed to create an equal sense of power. You might consider it a kind of failure to match at the affective level. Their objections were not tied to an explicit cry of outrage nor a promise to protect us from the wolves. Liberal ideology could not combat this splintering of our society by insisting we are all one people, since in fact we are fractured, with two mutually exclusive definitions of liberty, of democracy. And as I said, the problem lay in really facing and acknowledging this split. So another way to think of this is that paradoxically, defending democracy requires an understanding of its limits, of its boundaries, of what it cannot include. Refusing to believe in an enemy force that is antithetical to democracy right here in our country and cannot be contained within our democracy. That is, acknowledging the existence of an irreconcilable opposition, as there is between these two notions of liberty, actually impedes the defense of democracy. When the threat posed by the wolves' destructiveness is obfuscated, it is no longer possible to point out that theirs is not even the only and necessary form of capitalist business. We do see other capitalist countries that don't function the way ours does. It's of great interest to me, though, and it's beyond my scope here, by the way, that even naming class conflict was taboo up until very recently, and that this taboo is finally being lifted. But I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on some important psychological points that we should consider if we want to adopt the idea that only facing the harsh truth of the contradiction between organizing for profit and organizing for social good is what we must do, as we must face this contradiction, if we want to defend democracy. To defend a democracy that can contain conflict in a relatively nonviolent way. I want to really stress the idea that my idea of democracy is that conflict can be contained nonviolently, and I think that this idea is very it's skating on very thin ice, or it is very thin ice in America. So absent such a direct naming of the contradiction, I see no way to oppose national chauvinism, racism, and anti-immigration sentiment. We could say that without identifying the way the system really is rigged, it's impossible to counter the manipulation of legitimate fears and needs for self-protection, that this manipulation works by fostering an identification with the self-aggrandizement of the profit-making powerful. That is to say that one cannot simply counter authoritarianism the desire for submission to a powerful leader, who one can put in the place of one's ego ideal, as Freud put it, without something else that gives people their own power, their own self-cohesion, their own basis for subjectivity and agency. What is it that gives people both a basis for identification with the common good, a sense of their own power and subjectivity, and a sense of secure attachment to something like, the social whole or the society? Now, I think of those elements as being related to the notion of the third. In this case, a social third that is the principle of protecting the common good. And I do not see how it is possible to oppose the violation of the rules and laws of our polity, the attack on women's rights over their bodies, and especially the violence against a racially defined other in the name of white supremacy, without such a notion of a social third. These violations will all inevitably be tied into the principle of a few, being the deserving ones, who may exploit others and the earth to enhance themselves. It's necessary to spell out. Is it necessary to spell out why all these violations inevitably follow from the principle of profit? Perhaps it's worth it to spell that out. My own psychoanalytic perspective has been shaped in considering the intersubjective meaning of creating third spaces, the third, that contain and transform the complementary oppositions between self and other, especially oppositions that manifest socially as us versus the other, but also in the form of doer and done to. Such oppositions, mimicking the basic structure of perpetrator and victim, complementarity, powerful and subjugated, oppressor and oppressed, violator and violated, appear throughout our social life as well as in our consulting rooms. One lesson we've learned over time is that this relationship is reversible. That in do or done to relationships, both sides come to feel blamed and accused by, and thus symmetrically mirror each other. Insofar as an us-them opposition has become part of our political discourse, it's important not to be shaped defensively by those who attack or accuse us, launching us into the ping-pong match, the back and forth of blame. Very hard not to do that. What gets lost in such struggles around blame is the position that I think of as the basic lawful third. The position in which we recognize the general idea that not just some, but all individuals are entitled to dignity, to have their rights and their suffering respected. However, the problem is subtler and harder to manage when what we're dealing with is the necessity of recognizing wrongdoing and resulting suffering. In other words, it's very easy to say, oh, I embrace the position of the third that all people are entitled to dignity. But wait a minute. What do I do when there's actual harming in front of me? This is where the third really demands acknowledging wrongdoing and opening up to possibilities for reparation, maybe specifically for material reparations. We could talk about that. And for restoring goodness without the retaliation and punishment that is so delighted in by our culture. Although we don't hang people publicly anymore and cut off their noses and hands. And there are many people who I'm sure would like to. In presenting the idea of the third or third position, trying to get beyond doer and done to, we are also needing to go beyond the creation of a we that is opposed to some authority or power that unites us because we're constantly having to attack it. That's not the kind of we or us that we really mean when we're talking about a third, because in that case, even though we may seemingly get united within ourselves, we still have another do or don't do relationship taking place over here. So that's going to be a kind of splitting. It's kind of where we are now. What I think we're fighting for is a democratic third that would actually contain and negotiate this conflict so that we do not, to the same degree, have to feel hateful toward and persecuted by those others who are opposing and thwarting us right now. In theory, this would also mean that we would create a dialogue between us and them that does more than aim at grinding them into the dust, even though we might wish to do so at the moment. There are certain people we all want to grind into the dust right now. But that's partly because we are deprived of any third space, any democracy in which we could actually fight this out in a more legitimate way. So we not only, basically it's very simple, we not only have to fight against our opponents, we have to fight to create a democracy that would allow us to have a fair fight with our opponents. And that's really where I think we're stuck right now. How can we reopen a space for democratic civil conflict that we believe has been foreclosed by our opponents who, as we see it, break the rule of law at every step? That's our paradoxical setup at the moment. It's not only that those who have currently gained power in our government actually do believe that winning is everything and must be achieved at all costs. It's crucial for us to create a